Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tabor Talk. I'm your host, Michael Tabor. So, getting right into this, what I want to talk about, the topic of this video is fear. So, I'm listening to an older Tim Ferriss podcast with Carolyn Paul, and she has a book. This is actually in 2014, but the book is Gutsy Girl. I think that's the name of the book. So, and she talks a lot about overcoming fear. So, Tim talked about Gus D'Amato. Gus D'Amato was Mike Tyson's manager when Mike was just starting up, 19 years old. By the way, as most people know, Mike Tyson trained right where I live in the Catskills. So Gus D'Amato took this kid from, the story about Mike, School of Hard Knocks, kid always in trouble. Mike Tyson, 16 years old, I believe. And Gus said, "You're going to be the champion, the best ever." And he was right. So unfortunately, Gus didn't live to see Mike's rise, So anyway, Mike was 19 when he was champion, or 20, something like that. Anyway, so Gus D'Amato said to Mike, because by the way, I don't know if people know this, Mike Tyson was a very fearful person. If you watch, there's a great documentary, Tyson, he talks about that a lot. And there's some great documentary footage that I think he's 17 Golden Gloves or something, and he's crying. He's scared, and he's a human being, right? We all have fear. So Gus D'Amato said to Mike, he goes, "Listen, we all have fear. We all do, unless there's something pathological, unless there's something wrong with you, you have brain damage. But normal people, we all feel the same thing. It's how you respond to fear and what you do with it, right? So someone in combat or anything, a real life situation, a fire, or 9/11, like do you freeze and you tremble, or do you rise up to the occasion? So this feeling is the same. Like if you were to look at the chemistry, right, the chemicals, the same hormones, adrenaline, you fear, right? So there's nothing wrong with fear. It's what you do with it. So I had fear. Oh, let me give you another piece of wisdom. Words of wisdom, piece of pearls of wisdom, if you will. And by the way, my therapist said this too. He goes, make your world smaller. So the more fear, the bigger the world seems, and complicated, unmanageable. Shrink your world, which means control, or expand. Fear expands the world. Again, it's not the fear. Controlling fear, out of control fear. Let me phrase it that way. Out of control fear expands the world. Controlled fear makes the world smaller. Okay, so my personal life. When I was a kid, I was small. I got picked on, and I lived with a lot of fear, even in my neighborhood, just constantly in fear. And I was afraid of street fights. And what I was most afraid of was being on the bottom and some kid on top of me with his knees on my arms and pummeling. And by the way, that happened to me more than a few times, being in that situation. And this fear I had into my 20s. It wasn't until I took martial arts, and even Shaolin. I was like 3, 4, 5 years into Shaolin, and still my biggest fear was being on the bottom there and getting pummeled. But it wasn't until actually my 40s when I started training mixed martial arts, especially jiu-jitsu. And when you learn about jiu-jitsu, being on the bottom is not necessarily a compromising position. When you learn how to fight, like you could stop the raining of punches, like that ground and pound. There's a way, in fact, you could just bust the guy's arm if you know what you're doing. So I got to the point practicing mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu where I was super comfortable being on the bottom. I wasn't afraid of it. And another thing, just fighting in general. It was no big deal. Whereas when I was a younger man, I was terrified of a street fight. I mean, I still am. And by the way, I'm a grown man. I'm a middle-aged man. Like, fighting is stupid. And, it's the only time I'd ever resort to that as if, if someone attacked my wife, or it was a life and death situation. We all know that. So, and by the way, even out on the street, all there is a gun or a knife. I mean, I don't care if you're Jocko Willink, you're someone has a knife, man. You're history. What all the jujitsu in the world is not going to save you from a gun. So anyway, it's dangerous getting into a street fight. But I lost that fear, right? I shrunk my world. It became manageable. I learned about it. Now you could use this in any area of life. Like, for instance, I'm dealing with a serious neurological issue, motor neuron disease. I'm not going to get into the details here, but what made the fear less intense was just reading. I read constantly on what this is. Now, of course, it's a horrible thing, but it does. Once you learn, it makes it less intense. And the ultimate, we're all going to die someday. Read about. I mean, the way I've sort of dealt with it is I read whatever I can about it. I mean, so there you go. I just want to leave it on these two notes. Number one, if you're a normal person and you're not insane, you all experience fear. You're not a chicken shit if you experience fear. It's what you do with that fear. Okay. And number two, make your world smaller, not bigger. The smaller your world, the more control you have. Okay. Good friends, good books, and a sleepy conscience, peace, love, and understanding here on Tabor Talk. Hello again, and I just want to add to the classic conditioning to desensitize yourself. So just exposure therapy. Let me just give you a couple of more examples. Working in New York City when I was a young man in my early 20s, I mean, just going to the city used to be an incredibly just a fearful, anxiety-ridden experience. It was just too much for me. These tall buildings and the millions of people. It was just seemed to be chaos, and I was terrified of just going to the city. Well, I worked. Long story short, that I got over that fear. I worked in the city my whole life, decades. So, and you just overcome that fear, and the city became smaller. So when I was a kid, a teenager, whatever, the city was this huge, gigantic thing. Oh my God, tall buildings, all this chaos. And then, like 6 months in, exposure every day, going to work, it became like a little town, a little sort of town. I was living in New Jersey at the time. I'd take the bus, to go to Willowbrook, to take the bus, Port Authority, and then it became a small little town. I went to the same bagel shop, I got my coffee, and it was like, oh, it's my little town. New York City's my town. So there you go. So just exposure. Okay, on that note, good friends, good books, and a sleepy conscience. Peace, love on this side. Peace, love, and understanding here on Tabor Talk.